The world had seen bold declarations before, but nothing compared to what unfolded on that hot August morning in Ouagadougou. The city awoke to sirens, drums, and the sudden buzz of every radio and television station across the continent. At the heart of Burkina Faso's capital, in the marble-clad Grand Assembly Hall, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before a crowd of journalists, ministers, and foreign diplomats. His uniform was crisp, his beret angled with military precision, and his eyes blazed with a fire that seemed to pierce history itself. "Today," he began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of centuries, "marks the end of exploitation. From this moment forward, all foreign mining operations across Africa are to be shut down. Africa's resources will serve Africa's people, no longer the pockets of those who built empires on our suffering." The words echoed through the hall like thunder. At first, there was silence, as though no one truly believed what they had just heard. Then came the gasp, the murmurs, the frantic scribbling of pens. Cameras clicked like gunfire. Within minutes, the declaration rippled across the world, carried by satellite feeds and breaking news banners. In Paris, television anchors stumbled over their lines. In London, traders froze before their monitors. In Berlin, an emergency meeting was called within the Chancellor's office. And in Brussels, the heart of the European Union, panic set in. The lifeblood of Europe's industries, the gold, cobalt, uranium, and rare earth minerals extracted from African soil, had just been cut off with a single stroke of defiance. For centuries, Africa had been plundered. From the diamond mines of South Africa to the goldfields of Mali, from Congolese cobalt to Nigerian uranium, foreign powers had carved wealth from the earth, while leaving behind scars, poverty, instability, and corruption. To many, this was the natural order of the world. To Traoré, it was a chain around Africa's neck, and today, he had broken it. The hall erupted in chants, "Africa for Africans! Africa for Africans!" Ministers raised their fists, and students waved the Pan-African flag. Traoré allowed the energy to build before raising his hand for silence. "This is not a war," he continued, "but a liberation. We will not allow our continent to remain a colony disguised as a market. The time has come for us to stand tall, united, and independent. Let the world know, Africa will no longer beg. Africa will build." Outside, tens of thousands had gathered, waiting for news. When loudspeakers carried his words into the streets, the crowd exploded in celebration. Drums pounded, women ululated, and men hoisted children onto their shoulders. It was as though an invisible shackle had been shattered, and everyone could finally breathe free air. But beyond the cheering crowds, the reaction was less joyous. In corporate boardrooms across Europe, executives sat in stunned silence. Billions of dollars in contracts, infrastructure, and extraction rights had just evaporated. The phone lines between Paris, London, and Washington burned hot with urgency. Lobbyists pressed governments to respond. "Fast. Unacceptable," declared one European energy minister in a televised statement. "This decision threatens not only our economies but the stability of Africa itself. It cannot stand." Yet the truth was unavoidable. Traoré had pulled off what no African leader before him had dared. He had turned the tables on centuries of exploitation. Some journalists compared the moment to Ghana's independence in 1957 or Mandela's release in 1990. But others said it was even bigger. It was not just one country rising, but an entire continent taking its first collective step toward sovereignty. That evening, as the sun set over Ouagadougou, Traoré stood on the balcony of the presidential palace. Below, the crowd still roared, torches lighting up the night like a sea of stars. He looked at them, and he smiled, not with arrogance, but with determination. He knew the storm was coming. Europe would not surrender its lifeline without a fight. The corporations would push back, the powers would scheme. But tonight, Africa had hope. And hope, he thought, is stronger than gold. Long before Traoré's announcement shook the world, Africa's story had been written in sweat, blood, and stolen riches. For centuries, the continent had been seen, not as a home of proud nations and diverse civilizations, but as a vault, an endless treasure chest waiting to be emptied by foreign hands. It began with ships. European vessels, armed with cannons and greed, arrived on African shores in the 15th century. At first they came for spices, ivory, and slaves. Then, as the Industrial Revolution demanded more, they sought Africa's very bones, its minerals, its oil, its diamonds buried deep within the earth. The ground that once nourished generations became a battlefield of extraction. The Berlin Conference of 1884–85 carved the continent like a feast. Men in European capitals, none of whom had ever set foot in the Sahara or Congo, drew lines on maps, slicing apart kingdoms, tribes, and cultures. Entire nations were created overnight, not to honor history, but to divide resources. From South Africa's gold mines to the Congo's rubber plantations, the land bled. Villages were burned to force labourers into pits. Men worked until their lungs filled with dust, until their backs broke under the weight of ore. Women were left widowed, children grew up in hunger. And while Africans dug into the earth, Europe's cities grew rich. Palaces, railroads, and factories rose from the wealth of stolen minerals. The scars ran deep. By the early 20th century, diamonds from Kimberley shone in European crowns, while Congolese copper lit the streets of Paris. Uranium from Niger powered French reactors, even as Niger's villages lacked electricity. Gold from Mali adorned Swiss banks, while Malian farmers struggled to buy bread. Everywhere, the same story repeated. Africa extracted, Europe prospered. Africa labored, Europe feasted. And when the winds of independence swept across the continent in the 1950s and 1960s, the chains were not truly broken. Flags changed, but contracts remained. New African leaders inherited borders, drawn by strangers and economies, designed to serve outsiders. In the shadows of independent celebrations, corporations signed secret deals, ensuring that the mines, oil fields, and diamond pits continued to pump wealth into European and American markets. In Ghana, gold still flowed outward. In Nigeria, oil profits lined foreign pockets. In Congo, cobalt was shipped by the ton, feeding the growing hunger of modern technology. The colonialists had departed in form, but not in spirit. They had replaced armies with corporations, governors with executives, and whips with contracts. For the people, the pain endured. Generations grew up in poverty, standing atop soil worth trillions. Why are we poor, they asked, when our land is so rich? It was a question whispered in markets, shouted in protests, and carried like a wound in every African heart. By the early 21st century, the demand for Africa's minerals reached new heights. The digital revolution turned cobalt and coltan into blue gold. Rare earth minerals from Africa became essential for smartphones, computers, and electric cars. Once again, the continent was stripped bare to fuel the progress of others. And yet, resistance simmered. Writers, activists, and leaders spoke of liberation, not just political, but economic. They dreamed of an Africa that owned its destiny. But most who tried were silenced. Coups, assassinations, and foreign interference crushed many who dared challenge the order. From Patrice Lumumba to Thomas Sankara, the fate of defiant leaders was grim. This was the history Traoré carried on his shoulders when he stood before the world. He was not just shutting down mines. He was breaking a centuries-old cycle. He was striking at the heart of an empire that had never admitted its theft. The decision was more than politics. It was memory. It was every enslaved African shipped across oceans. It was every miner who died in darkness. It was every child who went to bed hungry while diamonds glittered on foreign necks. In Ouagadougou, as news of his decision spread, elders wept. They had lived through colonial rule, seen their resources drained, and buried their friends under the weight of poverty. To them, Traoré's words were not just a speech. They were healing, a promise that the wounds of the past might finally begin to close. But healing would not come easily. Europe had invested too much, taken too much, and depended too much to let go without a fight. The scars of Africa were not just reminders of the past. They were warnings of the struggles yet to come. And as night fell over the continent, the world wondered, could Africa finally break free from the ghosts of history? Or would the cycle of exploitation continue, wearing new masks but serving the same masters? The news struck Europe like an earthquake. Within hours of Traoré's announcement, the continent's capitals were in chaos. Markets reeled, headlines screamed. and governments scrambled to understand the scale of what had just happened. For decades, Africa's resources had flowed silently into the veins of European industry, unchallenged and uninterrupted. Now, the lifeline had been severed with a single declaration. In Paris, the Élysée Palace was swarming with ministers and advisers. President Dubois sat at the head of a long oak table, his face pale, his hand trembling over a glass of water. Reports stack high before him told the same grim story. Uranium from Niger, gone. Gold shipments from Mali, halted. Oil supplies threatened. France, whose nuclear energy grid relied heavily on African uranium, faced the unthinkable, blackouts within months. This is an act of aggression, the defense minister barked. If we allow this, France will be on its knees. But the foreign minister shook her head. Send troops? In this era? After Afghanistan? After Mali? Our people will not accept another war. We must find another way. The room erupted in argument. But one truth was clear. France had lost control of its backyard. Across the Channel, in London, the reaction was no calmer. In the financial district, traders watched as commodity prices exploded. Gold surged to record highs. Cobalt doubled within hours. Rare earth markets froze as buyers panicked. The London Stock Exchange bled billions in a single day. Inside 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister demanded answers. How could this happen overnight? We have treaties, we have agreements. A senior advisor replied with a grim tone. Agreements mean nothing if the mines are closed. Traoré has called our bluff. He knows we depend on him more than he depends on us. The Prime Minister slammed his fist on the table. Then we remind him who holds the real power. But the truth lingered unspoken. Power was slipping, and no one in the room knew how to stop it. In Berlin, Chancellor Weiss convened her cabinet in a bunker-like meeting room. Germany, Europe's industrial engine, relied heavily on African raw materials for its cars, electronics, and green technologies. Without cobalt and lithium from Africa, the nation's electric vehicle revolution would stall. We are facing an existential threat, Weiss admitted. This is not just about Africa, it is about the survival of European industry. One minister suggested sanctions. Another suggested leveraging NATO influence. But as the debate raged, an uncomfortable reality emerged. Europe's leverage over Africa was not what it once had been. And in Brussels, the European Union held an emergency summit. Leaders from across the bloc arrived in black cars, their faces grave. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, almost desperate. The European Commissioner for Trade opened bluntly. Colleagues, we are staring at economic catastrophe. Africa provides 60% of the cobalt we need, 40% of our uranium, and vast amounts of gold, platinum, and rare earths. Without it, our industries collapse. This is not rhetoric, it is fact. Then what do we do? Asked the Italian representative. The room fell silent. For all their power, for all their wealth, Europe's leaders realized they were trapped. They had built their prosperity on a foundation they did not control. And now, Traoré had pulled the foundation away. In the press, panic mingled with anger. European newspapers ran headlines in bold red letters. Mining shutdown, continent in crisis. Traoré holds Europe hostage. Is this the end of globalization? Talk shows raged with pundits demanding action. Some called for military intervention. Others warned that such a move would backfire disastrously, uniting Africa against Europe. Citizens, meanwhile, watched nervously as fuel prices rose and power companies whispered about shortages. For the corporations, the losses were staggering. Mining giants headquartered in London, Paris, and Zurich reported tens of billions wiped from their valuations in a single week. Executives demanded government action, but behind closed doors. Many admitted there was little to be done. As the days stretched into nights of emergency meetings, one chilling thought began to spread in Europe's corridors of power. What if this was only the beginning? What if Africa, emboldened by Traoré, truly rose as one? For centuries, Europe had looked at Africa as a supplier, not an equal. But now, as fear spread through its capitals, Europe was forced to confront a possibility it had long dismissed. The age of dominance might be over. While Europe drowned in boardroom panic and political hysteria, Africa erupted in celebration. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Lagos to Lusaka, the news of Traoré's decree spread like wildfire, igniting a wave of joy unseen since the first days of independence. In Ouagadougou, the streets were already filled with chants and music. Drums thundered in rhythm with the heartbeat of the city, and young men danced in circles, waving the red, green, and yellow flag of Burkina Faso. But it was not just a Burkinabe celebration. Across the crowd, the Pan-African flag flew proudly, red for blood, black for the people, green for the land. It was a symbol of unity, and tonight it fluttered above millions. Elderly women, wrapped in traditional cloth, clapped their hands and sang songs. Their ancestors once sang during resistance against colonizers. Children painted their faces with tribal patterns and wrote, "Africa for Africans" on cardboard signs. Taxi drivers blasted revolutionary songs from their radios, while street vendors handed out free water and roasted corn, declaring, "Tonight, we eat as free people." In Accra, Ghana, thousands marched to Independence Square. Some carried portraits of Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's founding father, chanting his famous words, "Africa must unite." For them, Traoré was not just a soldier from Burkina Faso, he was the heir to the dream Nkrumah once carried, a dream silenced too soon. In Lagos, Nigeria, the traffic came to a standstill as crowds flooded the streets. University students organized spontaneous rallies, holding banners that read, "No more exploitation," and "Our future, our resources." Social media exploded with videos of jubilant youth declaring that the age of begging was over. In Johannesburg, South Africa, a massive mural of Thomas Sankara, Traoré's revolutionary predecessor, was painted overnight on the side of a downtown building. The mural showed Sankara handing a torch to Traoré, with the words, "The struggle continues, the dream lives." And in the Congo, where the wounds of resource exploitation ran deepest, entire villages danced in the night. In places where children once mined cobalt barefoot for foreign corporations, parents now spoke with pride. Our sons will no longer dig graves for Europe's wealth. They will build Africa. The celebrations were not only physical, they were spiritual. Churches, mosques, and traditional shrines echoed with prayers of gratitude. Priests spoke of prophecy fulfilled. Imams invoked unity in the name of God. And elders of ancient tribes declared that the ancestors were smiling. For the younger generation, especially, the decision lit a fire of hope. For too long, they had grown up hearing that Africa was doomed to poverty, that jobs would always be scarce, that opportunities lay only overseas. Many had risked their lives crossing deserts and seas to reach Europe in search of survival. But now, for the first time, they saw a reason to believe that home could offer a future. A young Burkinabe student, interviewed by a local reporter, put it simply, "We don't want to run away anymore. We want to build here. Traoré gave us back our dignity." But amid the joy, there was also a current of determination. This was not naive celebration. People knew the fight was just beginning. Many remembered how past leaders who dared to challenge the system were silenced through coups, through assassinations, through foreign interference. Yet the chants rising in every city carried a defiant tone. They killed Sankara, but we are millions. They killed Lumumba, but Africa lives. The spirit of resistance, dormant for decades, was awake again. In the dusty town of Kaya, north of Burkina Faso, an old man leaned on his walking stick as children danced around him. His eyes glistened with tears as he whispered to no one in particular, "I never thought I would see this day. I thought I would die with the chains still on our land. But today, Africa breathes." Across the continent, hope surged like a river breaking its banks. For the first time in generations, the people of Africa did not just watch history, they felt they were writing it. And somewhere in the night, as bonfires blazed in villages and fireworks cracked above cities, the whispers of a new belief spread. This is not just Traoré's fight. This is our fight. This is Africa's rebirth. The ripple of Traoré's decision did not stop at Europe's borders. It swept across oceans, shaking the great powers of the world. In Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and beyond, leaders watched carefully, each calculating, how this sudden earthquake in Africa might shift the balance of global power. Washington, strategic alarm. At the White House, the Situation Room was filled with generals, economists, and advisors. The US president sat at the head of the table, his face grim. A large map of Africa glowed on the screen, highlighting key mining regions. This isn't just about Africa, the National Security Advisor warned. This is about us. Without African cobalt and rare earths, the supply chains for our technology and defense industries are at risk. Satellites, smartphones, even fighter jets rely on these materials. The Pentagon pressed for contingency plans, fearing that China or Russia might quickly fill the vacuum. If Africa cuts off Europe today, a general said, what's to stop them from cutting us off tomorrow? But the Secretary of State urged caution. We can't simply treat this as another Cold War. The African people are celebrating Traoré as a hero. If we push too hard, we'll look like the enemies of African freedom. That would destroy whatever soft power we still have on the continent. The president rubbed his temples. So what do we do? Engage. Negotiate. Offer partnerships, the secretary replied. If Europe goes in with threats, we go in with promises. We don't want to look like colonizers. We want to look like friends. The strategy was set. Washington would approach Traoré with diplomacy. But behind the smiles would be the same goal as always: control. Beijing. Calculated patience. In Beijing, the response was different. The Chinese leadership met in the Great Hall of the People. Their tone measured, almost calm. Africa has closed its minds to foreigners, the trade minister reported. But note, Traoré's words were directed at Europe. He said foreign exploitation, not partnerships. This leaves room. China, which had spent decades building roads, railways, and ports across Africa in exchange for resources, saw opportunity where others saw disaster. We must not rush, the Premier said. Let Europe panic. Let America worry. We will position ourselves as Africa's true ally. We will speak of equality, of mutual development. And when the time comes, Africa will turn to us willingly. Already, Chinese diplomats were drafting statements of support, praising Africa's sovereignty while quietly preparing new offers of cooperation. Unlike Europe, China did not fear the end of exploitation. It smelled the chance to replace the exploiters. In Moscow, President Volkov watched the news with a grin. For years, Russia had sought ways to undermine Western dominance, and now Traoré had handed him a gift. This is the crack in the wall we've been waiting for, he told his advisors. Europe bleeds, America hesitates, China schemes, but we act. We will support Africa openly, militarily if needed. And in return, they will see us as the shield against Western imperialism. Already, Russian media outlets were celebrating Traoré, painting him as a revolutionary in the mold of past Soviet allies. Propaganda posters were drafted, showing African and Russian hands clasped in solidarity. Behind the rhetoric, Russia's interests were clear: uranium, oil, and gold. But unlike Europe, Russia was willing to play the long game, offering weapons, training, and political cover in exchange for influence. Other nations, too, scrambled to respond. India saw both threat and opportunity, worried about resource shortages but eager to present itself as a neutral partner. Brazil and several South American nations expressed open solidarity, drawing parallels to their own struggles against colonial exploitation. The Middle East, particularly the Gulf states, weighed how the shutdown might impact global oil markets and their own influence. At the United Nations, the Assembly Hall buzzed with fiery speeches. African ambassadors spoke with newfound confidence, demanding recognition of their continent's right to self-determination. Western diplomats struggled to balance condemnation with diplomacy. For the first time in decades, the global order felt unstable. Lines were being drawn not just between nations, but between visions of the future. To Europe, Traoré was a threat. To America, he was a challenge. To China, he was an opportunity. To Russia, he was a weapon. To the African people, he was hope. And as each power plotted its next move, one truth became clear: the fate of Africa was no longer a quiet, hidden matter of contracts and boardrooms. It was now the center stage of world politics. The world was watching, and Africa was no longer silent. when Traoré announced the shutdown of foreign mining operations. His words did not just echo through parliaments and palaces, they detonated in the heart of the global economy. Within 24 hours, financial markets spiraled into chaos. Gold, the eternal refuge of uncertain times, surged to heights never before seen. From New York to Zurich, investors scrambled to secure bullion, pushing prices past records at a speed that stunned even seasoned traders. Vaults that once held Africa's gold now stood empty. And Europe, which had relied on a steady flow from Burkina Faso, Mali, and South Africa, found itself in a desperate race to secure alternative supplies. For the first time in living memory, African nations themselves refused to sell to foreign buyers. Gold belongs to Africa, declared a joint statement from several West African governments. Instead of shipping it to European banks, they began discussions on creating a Pan-African Reserve Fund, keeping the wealth within their borders. In Antwerp, the diamond capital of the world, dealers sat frozen as shipments from Botswana, South Africa, and Angola halted overnight. The glittering stones that fueled Europe's luxury markets were suddenly out of reach. Jewelers panicked, and prices skyrocketed. But beyond the panic, darker markets stirred. Smuggling routes, long used to siphon Africa's diamonds under colonial contracts, now faced crackdowns as African militaries tightened their grip. For the first time, the diamonds of Africa were slipping beyond Europe's reach, not into the shadows, but into African vaults. Uranium, France's nightmare. Nowhere was the impact felt more sharply than in France. For decades, France's nuclear reactors, its pride and backbone, had run on uranium mined from Niger and Gabon. Suddenly, those supplies were gone. The French energy grid trembled, and warnings of rolling blackouts spread across the country. In Paris, protesters filled the streets, demanding answers. Why should our lights go out? One banner read. While Africa keeps its power for itself. The irony was bitter. For generations, African villages had lived without electricity, even as their uranium lit up European cities. Now the roles were reversing. The collapse of cobalt. Perhaps the most devastating blow came with cobalt and coltan, essential to the batteries that powered the modern world. Laptops, smartphones, electric cars, all depended on African cobalt, most of it from the Democratic Republic of Congo. When the mines went silent, the tech industry staggered. Factories in Germany halted production lines. Electric car companies in the US delayed launches. Smartphone giants announced shortages. Stock prices crashed. A single African decision had brought Silicon Valley and European industry to their knees. Markets in freefall. Stock exchanges across Europe bled. London, Paris, and Frankfurt lost trillions in value within weeks. Energy companies collapsed. Mining giants declared bankruptcy. Commodity markets turned volatile, swinging wildly as desperate buyers sought new sources. The International Monetary Fund called it the greatest economic disruption since the 2008 financial crisis. A resource earthquake, one analyst declared, that has shattered the foundations of globalization. Africa holds the cards. For the first time, Africa was not begging for loans, it was dictating terms. Leaders gathered in Addis Ababa under the banner of the African Union, exploring the creation of an African commodities exchange, a system that would allow them to control the prices of their own resources. We are no longer the suppliers of the world's wealth, declared one African minister. We are the owners, and the owners set the rules. Traoré, though not alone, became the face of this new defiance. In speeches broadcast across the continent, he urged patience. We know the world is in chaos, he said, but for the first time, the chaos serves us. Let us not squander it. A new kind of war. Yet not all battles are fought with guns. The economic war had begun. Sanctions. Europe began drafting sanctions against Burkina Faso and its allies, hoping to isolate them financially. Currency manipulation. Western banks attempted to destabilize African currencies, sparking inflation. Propaganda. Media outlets portrayed Traoré as reckless, dangerous, a dictator who would ruin Africa's future. But for every attack, Africa found resilience. Communities turned inward, trading locally, building new cooperatives. Farmers saw higher prices for their crops as African governments encouraged domestic trade, and where Western companies fled, new alliances formed with Asia, with South America, with each other. The turning point. Economists warned of long-term instability, but for ordinary Africans, the short-term pain was worth it. Yes, imports became expensive. Yes, markets grew unstable. But for the first time in history, they were not sacrificing for the wealth of Europe, they were sacrificing for themselves. In the marketplaces of Lagos, women sellers summed it up simply. 4 generations, they took everything, and we got nothing. Now, if we must suffer, at least it is our suffering, not theirs. The economic war was far from over. Europe prepared to strike back harder, and global corporations were already plotting new ways to re-enter Africa's minds. But the balance of power had shifted, and as one African newspaper declared in bold letters, the world cannot function without Africa, and Africa has finally remembered its worth. The Grand Hall of the African Union in Addis Ababa had never felt so alive. Every seat was filled, presidents, ministers, generals, and diplomats from all 54 African nations. Outside, tens of thousands crowded the streets, waving Pan-African flags, their chants echoing against the marble walls. Around the world, millions tuned in to watch live. At the center of it all stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, dressed in his simple military uniform, without medals or pomp. He looked less like a dictator and more like a soldier of the people. The room fell silent as he approached the podium. For a moment, he said nothing. He let the silence hang, heavy and expectant. Then, in a voice steady but full of fire, he began. Brothers and sisters of Africa, for centuries, our land has been rich, yet our people have been poor. Our soil has given gold, diamonds, uranium, oil, yet our children have gone hungry. Our rivers have powered foreign cities, while our villages lived in darkness. We were called independent, but we remained chained. Today, we break those chains. The world is shocked because Africa has dared to stand. They ask, how can Africa shut its minds? How can Africa deny Europe, America, the powerful nations of the earth? I say to them, how could we not? How long must we die for others to live? They say we are reckless. They say we are endangering the world economy. But I ask, what is more reckless than 500 years of exploitation? What is more dangerous than a system where millions starve while their land feeds strangers? Today, we declare, Africa is not for sale. This decision is not against Europe. It is not against America. It is not against China or Russia. It is for Africa. It is for our farmers, our miners, our children, our unborn generations. It is for dignity. But make no mistake, this is only the beginning. The world will not applaud us. They will attack us with lies. They will attack us with sanctions. Some may even try to attack us with guns. They will try to divide us, to turn brother against brother, nation against nation. But if we stand together, if we remember that the same sun shines on all of us from Cape Town to Cairo, then no force on this earth can break us. Kwame Nkrumah dreamed of this day. Patrice Lumumba died for this dream. Thomas Sankara lived and fell with this dream on his lips. Today, we do not only remember them, we continue what they began. Let the world hear us clearly. Our gold will build our schools. Our diamonds will fund our hospitals. Our uranium will power our cities. Our oil will fuel our own industries. Our cobalt will drive our cars, not theirs. No longer will Africa be the beating heart that pumps wealth to the world while its own body starves. From this day forward, Africa beats for itself. This is our rebirth. This is our revolution. This is the dawn of a free Africa. The hall erupted. Leaders rose to their feet, some with tears in their eyes, others with fists raised high. The crowd outside roared like thunder, their chants of Africa, Africa, shaking the ground. Across the world, television screens flickered with images of Traoré's defiance. In Europe, anchors spoke of a dangerous populist. In America, analysts called him a threat to global stability. In Russia and China, commentators hailed him as the voice of a new world. But in Africa, none of that mattered. What mattered was the sound of millions, from villages to megacities. repeating the words they had just heard. Africa is not for sale. The weeks after Traoré's speech were electric. Across Africa, his words spread like wildfire, igniting movements, rallies, and declarations of solidarity. But in the capitals of Europe and Washington, the mood was far darker. Behind closed doors, in a private room in Brussels, European intelligence chiefs gathered. Documents lay scattered on the table, economic reports, transcripts of Traoré's speeches, and photos of African crowds. He has become more than a leader, one official whispered. He is becoming a symbol, and symbols are dangerous. Another leaned forward, voice cold. Symbols can be erased. The plan was never spoken directly, but everyone in the room knew what it meant. Traoré was joining the long list of African leaders who dared to defy the West, and whom history remembered not for how they lived, but how they died. The first attacks, words, and money. The campaign began subtly. International media outlets published stories painting Traoré as a tyrant. Editorials warned of a return to authoritarianism. Think tanks accused him of dragging Africa into chaos. At the same time, Western banks launched financial attacks. Currency values wavered. Inflation crept higher. Anonymous hackers struck African government systems, disrupting communications. The aim was clear: weaken his image, erode his support, turn his people against him. But instead of breaking, the people grew angrier. They fear him because he speaks truth, said a Nigerian student in Lagos. If he were weak, they would ignore him. Their fear proves his strength. The shadows move. When words and money failed, shadows moved. In Ouagadougou, Traoré's intelligence unit intercepted encrypted messages between foreign agents and local collaborators. The chatter was unmistakable. An assassination was being prepared. Rumors spread quickly: an ambush, a poisoned gift, a sniper. Each possibility carried echoes of Africa's bloody past. Lumumba in Congo, Sankara in Burkina Faso. Leaders silenced before their vision could take root. But this time, the people were alert. The night of fire. It happened on a humid night in Ouagadougou. Traoré had just finished a late meeting with his cabinet and was returning to the presidential compound. The streets were quiet, guarded by loyal soldiers. Then, an explosion ripped through the night. A car parked along the roadside detonated in a ball of fire, shaking the ground and shattering windows. Gunfire erupted from the shadows. Armed men with foreign rifles moved in, their target clear. Traoré's convoy swerved. His bodyguards reacted instantly, shielding him as bullets pierced the air. Sirens wailed. The battle raged for minutes that felt like hours. But the attackers had underestimated the city. Within minutes, civilians poured from their homes, young men, women, even elders, rushing toward the gunfire. They chanted Traoré's name, throwing stones, blocking escape routes, overwhelming the assassins with sheer numbers. By dawn, the attackers were dead or captured. And when interrogations began, the truth came out: passports from Europe, satellite phones from foreign agencies, money trails leading back to offshore accounts. The morning after, when Traoré appeared on state television the next morning, he wore no armor, no bandages, only his uniform. His eyes were sharp, his voice calm. "They tried to kill me," he said bluntly. "Not because of who I am, but because of what I represent. They want to silence Africa again. But hear me clearly: you cannot kill a people's dream. You cannot kill a continent's awakening." His words sent shockwaves. Across Africa, protests erupted outside European embassies. Social media blazed with hashtags: #HandsOffAfrica and #TraorLives. In Mali, crowds marched with signs declaring, "If you touch one of us, you touch all of us." In Kenya, students occupied campuses, demanding their government break ties with Western corporations. And in Burkina Faso itself, murals appeared overnight, painted on city walls, Traoré's face surrounded by the words, "They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds." A warning to the world. The failed assassination became a turning point. For decades, such acts had crushed African movements. But now, it had done the opposite. It had united them. Analysts in London and Washington were stunned. The attempt has backfired. one admitted on live television. Instead of weakening him, it has made him stronger. And Traoré, standing before a sea of his people, declared with fire in his voice, "You have seen their desperation. You have seen their fear. If they attack me again, I will fall as a man. But Africa will rise as a giant. And giants do not kneel." The smoke of the assassination attempt had not yet cleared when a new reality emerged. If the West thought fear would divide Africa, they were mistaken. Instead, nations began to close ranks, forging bonds stronger than at any point in modern history. Addis Ababa, the African Union transformed. The African Union summit that followed was unlike any before it. Gone were the days of half-hearted resolutions and empty declarations. This time, urgency burned in every word. Delegates from across the continent sat shoulder to shoulder, speaking not as fragmented states but as parts of one body. The attempted killing of Traoré had made the stakes clear. Unity was not an option, it was survival. From Nigeria came the proposal for a Pan-African bank, independent of the IMF and World Bank, funded by African resources. South Africa proposed a continental energy grid, powered by African uranium, gas, and solar power. Kenya and Ghana championed the creation of an African Defence Pact, pledging that an attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. For the first time, the AU Hall erupted not in polite applause, but in roaring agreement. The Pan-African currency. Perhaps the boldest idea came from Burkina Faso itself. Traoré's finance minister unveiled plans for a single Pan-African currency, backed not by foreign reserves, but by Africa's gold and resources. "We will no longer trade in dollars, euros, or francs," he declared. "We will trade in our own strength, and our strength is vast." The hall buzzed. For decades, Africa's currencies had been tied to colonial powers, especially the CFA franc under French control. To break free was more than economics, it was psychological liberation. Within weeks, committees were formed, economists consulted, and pilot projects announced. For the first time in history, Africa was moving toward a financial system that served Africans first. Solidarity beyond Africa. But Africa was not alone. Across the world, voices rose in solidarity. Latin America, leaders in Bolivia, Venezuela, and Brazil praised Traoré's defiance. "Their struggle is our struggle," declared a fiery speech in Caracas. The same empire that drained Africa drained Latin America. "Together, we rise." Asia, India offered technological cooperation, presenting itself as a non-colonial partner. Southeast Asian nations expressed interest in resource-sharing agreements, eager to break Western monopolies. Middle East, some Gulf states, wary of Western dominance, extended financial aid, hoping to strengthen ties with a rising Africa. Even in Europe, cracks appeared. Grassroots movements and youth organizations marched in solidarity with Africa, chanting slogans against their own government's colonial legacies. The most urgent question remained defense. If one assassination attempt had already been made, more would follow. At a secret meeting in Bamako, military leaders from Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Guinea signed what came to be known as the Sahel Defense Accord. They pledged to share intelligence, weapons, and soldiers, creating a joint military force capable of defending against external aggression. Other nations soon signaled interest. Ethiopia, Angola, and Algeria offered logistical support. South Africa pledged naval assistance. Slowly, the blueprint for a continental army began to form. Everywhere, the names of past visionaries returned to life. Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, once silenced, now reborn in chants, murals, and speeches. In Ghana, students painted Nkrumah's famous words, "Africa must unite," across university walls. In Congo, Lumumba's portrait was carried through the streets, beside Traoré. In Burkina Faso, a massive mural appeared, Sankara's face on one side, Traoré on the other, connected by the words, "The dream continues." The rise of a new African bloc stunned the globe. In Washington, strategists warned of a second Cold War, this time not between East and West, but between the global North and a united global South. In Paris, panic spread through government halls. Without African uranium, France's energy grid faced collapse. Without African gold, French banks weakened. In Beijing, smile spread. China saw opportunity in offering partnerships, yet it, too, realized Africa was no longer a junior partner but a power in its own right. In Moscow, propaganda celebrated a new ally in the global struggle against imperialism. But beyond all calculations, one truth rang clear: Africa had stepped out of the shadows. It was no longer a playground of empires, but a player in its own right. The African Union issued a declaration that shook the world. From this day forward, Africa will not be a subject of history. It will be the author. We will trade on equal terms. We will defend each other. We will speak with one voice. And to those who seek to divide us, know this: Africa is united. The cheers that followed rolled across the continent like thunder. In the villages of Burkina Faso, elders who had lived through colonial rule wept as they watched on television. In the streets of Nairobi, students danced with Pan-African flags. In Lagos, traders shouted, "We are no longer colonies." And in Ouagadougou, Captain Traoré stood on a balcony overlooking a sea of people, their chants rising into the night sky. One Africa, one voice, one destiny. Europe had been reeling from Traoré's rise for months. Stocks were in freefall, energy grids strained, and the continent's political establishment faced unprecedented chaos. The time for reaction had come. The European Council convened an emergency summit in Brussels. Leaders from France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom gathered, their faces pale but determined. "We cannot allow this defiance to continue," the French president declared. "If Africa controls its resources and unites, Europe loses influence permanently." The German chancellor added, "Our industries will collapse. Our citizens will suffer. We must act decisively." A plan was drawn, swift, strategic, and multi-layered. 1. Economic sanctions, targeted against Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and other nations supporting the Pan-African bloc. Banks were instructed to freeze accounts and halt loans. 2. Diplomatic isolation. Embassies were ordered to lobby allies to condemn Traoré publicly, framing him as a destabilizing force. 3. Media campaign. European media outlets, coordinated to portray Traoré as reckless, authoritarian, and dangerous to global stability. 4. Military threats. While reluctant to deploy troops immediately, contingency plans were drawn, including joint exercises near African coasts and strategic air patrols. The propaganda offensive. European newspapers ran alarming headlines. "Africa defies civilization. Traoré threatens global stability. Is this the end of free trade?" Television channels aired expert panels analyzing the dangers of a united Africa, warning of economic collapse and social unrest. Analysts in London and Paris emphasized that Africa's leaders were inexperienced and reckless, attempting to manipulate markets with dangerous nationalism. Social media campaigns targeted African youth, spreading fear about rising prices, inflation, and shortages. Anonymous accounts warned, Africa cannot survive alone. Sanctions hit quickly. European banks froze billions of dollars in African reserves. Import tariffs were increased. Commodity exchanges attempted to block African exports. Energy supply contracts were threatened. Yet the Pan-African bloc responded strategically. The newly formed African Commodities Exchange rerouted exports to Asia, Latin America, and Middle Eastern partners. African nations began using the Pan-African currency for trade, bypassing Western banking systems entirely. In Lagos, the ports were buzzing, not with European ships, but with freighters from India, China, Brazil, and the Gulf states. The economic squeeze, intended to weaken Africa, became a catalyst for independence. In the UN, European diplomats pushed for condemnations, sanctions, and resolutions. But African